third video in this 4-part series on web scraping, and today in this lesson we're going to be looking at how to scrape a coronavirus stats site, very similar to what we looked at with Avi Shiffman, and actually put those results and display them using Flask on the front end. So we're going to have 6 easy steps, and if you're an advanced user you might want to pause the screen and have a look at these steps and the code that I'll show you and quite quickly finish it. However, if you'd like to hear an explanation and see it done step by step, please continue watching. So the 6 steps are as follows, and the site that we're going to be using is here. This is the URL. In fact, you can just sort of Google worldometers and it should come up. Again, we're just going to be working with those 2 files. The first one is the webscraper.py and the second one is home.html. So on webscraper.py you have 6 things to add, as you can see in the screen. And on home.html, you simply pass in the variables from the Python that you've extracted and use Ginger to display it on the Flask website. So you remember that in the previous video, we had a website set up which scraped some quotes and author details from a site called Quotes to Scrape. But today what we want to do is we want to actually look at this coronavirus site, which is here. It's worldometers, and it gives us some live stats on coronavirus cases, deaths, and recovered. So you can see that I've already gone into the inspect element, and it's funny seeing these numbers here like that, because of course my dad not too long ago, he was an NHS doctor, he is an NHS doctor, and got coronavirus, was seriously ill, couldn't breathe, was in hospital for weeks. We were told to expect the worst, but he did finally recover. My husband got it. So it's a very personal thing. It's very sad to see these stats like this. And of course, coronavirus is still very much something to be reckoned with in our world. But looking at it quite technically, we can see that each of these 3 things are found in the div class main counter number, and we can see that that's the name that we're looking for. So if I grab that, if you just make a note of it, main counter number, we know that that's where, and it's going to be repeating because you can see that the CSS is exactly the same, that's where we find these 3 different records. So we're going to remember that for now and go back to our Sublime text to start coding. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to actually, so if you refer to the Sublime text that you had before, just delete everything and keep the root, of course, and get rid of whatever data you have here, which is, I think, quotes and author. And let's begin from the beginning, just giving you that confidence to work with this beautiful soup yourself, knowing that you can call it, you can use whatever variables you want, etc. We'll start with URL, and of course we're trying to use this URL, so we copy and paste it and we put it in there. Let's end it with a little backslash, and that's the URL. Of course, then we set up the requests and we get the URL, which is being passed. Now here in the last video I called it soup. This is basically creating an object of beautiful soup. Remember, when you create an object, the object inherits everything from its parent class. It can use all the attributes and the methods. We can call it anything, and just to be explicit, let's call it BS object, so you get the understanding of what you're creating. So BS object is equal to beautiful soup, and we're passing in some parameters here, request.text, as you'll see how that is used in a minute, and previously we used LXML. Let's just for now just type in HTML parser, and this should achieve exactly the same thing. Now, this is where we actually get into the programming side of things. And remember, what we're trying to do is from this site, we're trying to obtain some data. We're trying to get the data of those 3 records. So let's call it data. You can call it anything, coronavirus. I'll call it data. And we're going to use the object that we just set up, so BS object. And this time we're going to use a command, and you can see it's sort of suggesting it for me, called find all. And we're going to find all the instances. Remember, it was in a div in the class, and if you can remember, I'm struggling to remember, I think it was main counter. number, and that was the name of the thing that we're trying to identify and extract everything from. So we've got that. Now, to demonstrate and to show you what is held now in this data, I could just print it and run the Python screen, but just to show you how you pass it again to Flask so we can render it on the web page, let's pass it through on our root here. So data is equal to data, nice and easy. You go back to your home page. Of course, you don't want quotes there, so you just change it to data and save all. Now remember, you go back to your command prompt. My server is still running, so I'm just going to run that. And it says beautiful soup is not defined, and the reason for that, this is great, the command prompt always will give you the errors. I've spelt beautiful wrong, so I'll just change that and go back, run my server, python webscraper.py. If there are no errors, it should run the server. Brilliant. So I go back up here, type in my 127 etc. Not the about, just the plain page, and brilliant. What it's done is it's now on the screen. What you're seeing is the contents of that data variable. Now this is not what we want, because you can see there's a number here, and there's another number here, and there's another number here, and it's got all these tags around it. That's not what we want. Suppose for the sake of this video, all we want is this number, and we want to do something with this number, and then perhaps with I think it was a number of deaths, to figure out a percentage and do some calculations. So how do we do that? So let's go back to our code. Now over here, this is where we've actually isolated every instance of the thing that is contained in main counter.number. But that's not what we want. Now remember we said about arrays and working with arrays. Let me show you what this would contain. Now if I said that data, if I said total cases was equal to data 0, let's just do a bit of experimenting just to show you what happens. Now actually, for simplicity, say data is equal to data 0. Okay, and you can see what it's done is instead of giving me the 3 values, it's given me the first element. Assuming, just think of it like an array, you have 0, 1, 2, right? So 0 is giving me the first of those numbers. So following on from that, you would assume that 1 would give me the second, and 2, if I put in 2, it would give me the number of deaths. So for now, let's just leave it at 0, and let's start to call this something more sensible. So let's say total cases is equal to data 0, but again, if you look back at what we have rendered on the web page, it doesn't look very nice. That's not how I want it rendered on the web page. I don't want these tags around there. And so this is where we actually use some Python to get rid of what we don't want. And the first command is going to be text. And literally what that does, this always helps me in an unhelpful way. So let's just say text. What this does is I'm going to pass in total cases here. And we save all and go back. It's a little bit slow to refresh there. And what you then suddenly see is that you see just the number, which is exactly what we want. So if you go back, you can now determine or conclude that what this dot text does is it gets rid of all the tags that you don't want. But we actually need to do a whole bunch more than that if we want to work with this as an integer. So another thing that you can't quite see, so if you go back to your web page, something you can't see is there might be leading spaces at the front and also at the back. There could be all kinds of things that you can't really see, but they might be there. And you need to get rid of them as well. And we do that using the strip command. Now I'll quickly demonstrate to you how strip works. It will be incredibly useful in web scraping in general. And this is how it works. So say you had a string which is held in a variable called text. Right, so I've got this just like nonsense string. And really what I want is I want the word test and track. But I want to get rid of all the other things that are not test and track. So what I've done is I've made another variable called x, and I've said text.strip, and in between these brackets I specify everything I want to strip it of. I'll give you another example. So if I wrote banana here, oops, banana, very difficult word to spell, and then I say I want to strip it of, I'll get rid of the dot here. So I want to strip it of any comma, ngr, and I click run. What you'll see is it will strip it of everything that is mentioned inside these brackets. I didn't put in a dot. If I do add a dot and I run, you'll see that it'll strip it of the dots as well and just leave the word banana. So that's how strip works, and it's, like I said, it's very incredibly useful, particularly for web scraping. So if we go back, we can see that this is what we have so far. But another thing we need to do is we need to actually replace, we need to strip it first of all. So I could just say text.strip, and this would strip it and turn it into text, which is great. But there's one more thing we need to do, and that is if you look at this data which has been generated, you see it has commas on it, in between it. And we don't want that, because otherwise we can't turn it easily into an integer, and we need it to be an integer in order to work with it, to make percentages and do clever stuff with it. So how do we get rid of that? We use a command called replace. Now, as I said, W3 Schools has all of these things and more, and if there's anything that you're looking for, I would recommend just looking up their reference for Python. But for now, let's actually set up the entire thing as we want it. So the two variables that I want are total cases, and I also want recovered. So I'm going to make those two variables, and I'm going to populate those variables with the data that I want. So I'm going to say data 0, because that's the element that I'm trying to retrieve for total cases, and say .text.strip as well. And I'm also going to use this new thing called replace, and this is going to allow me to replace those commas in the positions that I specify, like so. Okay, and then I end it, of course, with brackets. Right, so I've got two brackets there, and I start it with a bracket there. Now, this in itself is great. It is stripping it, it's putting it into just the text format, and it's also getting rid of those little commas. But there's something else that's missing, and the fact is this total cases variable is actually a string. So what we're retrieving, what we're putting into total cases is a string. It's not an integer. So what we need to do there is we need to cast this. It's called casting. Basically turn it into an integer, and we do that by typing in int on one side, and that's why we have the second bracket there. Okay, so int, this will turn in this entire thing that we've sort of isolated into a integer. Now we do exactly the same thing for recovered, but of course we call it recovered, and this time we're not looking at the 0th element, we're looking at the second, because that was the recovered, I think, if I'm right there, and we do that. So that's pretty much done there. Now if I wanted to just check that this is working, I can see that I've already passed this total cases, so I'm going to save it, go back, and just watch to see. And you can see here that the commas have been removed. So this is great. This is an integer. We can work with it like an integer. Now I need to show you, and so that just that you understand, if you work with something which wasn't an integer, so if I said x is equal to input enter number, and I said print x plus 3, now watch what happens. If I run this program and I put in a number, the console is for some reason not allowing me to enter something in here. But if it happened to be a string number, and I can demonstrate that like this, perhaps more easily, right? So if it's a string and it's not an integer, and I try to print something, it would print, because it can't convert integer object into string implicitly. So it cannot do ordinary mathematics. It would, in fact, it would concatenate if you're using a different thing. So 3 plus 3, it would treat it like two strings and put them together. So really you need to convert, but when it is already an integer, then you can work with it as an integer. You can do clever things, which is what the intention is here. So the thing that I would like to do is I'd like to find out, I'm just thinking on the spot, so if I get my maths wrong here, forgive me, I'd like to find out maybe the percentage of recovered cases. So let's make another variable called percentage recovered, and of course that would be the recovered cases over the total cases times 100, something like that, right? Just checking to see that the maths works here. And then of course that's going to give us a huge number which is not rounded down, so let's just do a bit of rounding down. Percentage recovered, isn't it? And you round down that percentage recovered by, say, 2. And I'm going to pass that through kind of wish I had a shorter variable now. Percentage recovered. There are bound to be some errors, we can see in a minute. And of course here I would like it to say total cases, so I could say something like total cases, and I could have an additional p tag down here which says recovered and put in my variable. And to have a bit of a break between them, doesn't look too squashed up. Right, so if I save all and I run my very slow server, I'm just going to quit it again and run it. Let's just look for any errors that might be there. Unbelievably, there are no errors. And if I refresh, it says total cases, and then it gives me a percentage there, which for some reason hasn't rounded, so I'll come back to that. So you can see how easy it is really to scrape, but also to work with the numbers, to do things like split.text, replace, to get what you need, and then to actually do clever things with it. Now of course this doesn't look very beautiful, and you might be thinking, oh, how did he put it in a table and make it look all flashy? So we're going to look at how to do something like that in a very basic, using Bootstrap. And of course you can then go off and customize, think about what you want to scrape, and do whatever you'd like yourself. So that's going to be in the next video. So I know what you're saying in your head. You're saying, great, so we know how to scrape, we've done all the back end stuff, we set up beautiful soup, we know how to display it on the front end, but that's not exactly what I want. What if I want multiple values, like a table, and displayed in a table? So that's what we're going to do in the next video. We're going to use a Bootstrap table, something like this. We're going to get 5 companies which we're going to scrape from somewhere with their revenue, with their live data there, and we're going to put it on our scraping stuff site.